The Path is a teaching series sponsored by World Missionary Evangelism. We hope that this series will deepen your knowledge and walk in our Lord Jesus Christ. Here's your host, John Cathcart.
Well, we're talking about the city of Antioch, to which the fathers of the church at Jerusalem sent Barnabas, and Barnabas went to Tarsus to find Paul and bring him back so that they could minister together and lead the church in Syrian Antioch. Well, we've tried to describe what Antioch was like, both from a cultural point of view and from a natural point of view. Let's talk about the spiritual point of view. For the great mass of population in Antioch, there was absolutely nothing that could be truly called a religion to serve as a barrier against the ever-rising flood of Roman sensuality and Greco-Syrian suppleness. And what religion there was took the form of the crudest nature worship or the most imbecilic superstition. Well, a few years before the foundation of a Christian church at Antioch, actually in the year 37 AD, or about 3 years after the death of Jesus, a terrible earthquake had occurred, to which this city in all ages seems to have been liable. And it might seem at first slightly incredible that an intellectual and literary city like Antioch, a city of wits and philosophers, casuists and rhetoricians, of poets and satirists, should at once become the dupes of a wretched quack named Deborius. There is no end to the quacks that can deceive people, and people seem to welcome it. This is a strange feature. It is even so today in the United States of America. So this quack named Deborius professed to avert such terrors, that's a terror of earthquake, by talismans which are about as ridiculous as the famous earthquake pills, which we have found in modern life. Yet there is really nothing strange in such apparent contrast, because history more than once has shown that the borders of atheism reach to the confines of strange crudity. Well, in this city of pagan pleasure, and into the midst of a population paupered by public doles and polluted by the indulgences which they procured, among the intrigues and ignominies of some of the lowest of the human race, at one of the lowest points in human history. Can you imagine this? Into this situation comes the Apostle Paul. Now, you might think that the Lord would send Paul into fields that were more spiritual and more religious, but no, the Lord sends Paul into this decadent, corrupt, ridiculous place. And so into the city of Antioch comes the eager spirit of Saul of Tarsus. Well, on his way, some 5 miles from the city, he must have seen upon the river bank at least the fringe of laurels and cypresses and myrtle trees that marked a pagan site called the Sweet Grove of Daphne by the Orontes, and he must have caught sight, perhaps, of the colossal statues of Apollo, pagan god Apollo, that had been reared by Seleucus Nicator. But the place was sweet no longer, except in its natural and ineffaceable beauty, and it is certain that a few faithful Jews would not willingly have entered its polluted precincts, those precincts being endowed with the right of asylum. Now, if there's one thing, and we're learning this in the United States of America, if there's one thing corrupts cities, it is the right of asylum for one and all. And the asylums of ancient and modern days are far more a protection to outrageous villainy than to persecuted innocence. And those groves of Daphne, the pagan goddess, were the dark haunts of every kind of foulness. And for their scenic loveliness, their rich foliage, their fragrant herbage, their perennial fountains, for these things the fiery-hearted Saul had little taste. He could only have recalled with a sense of disgust how that grove of Daphne had given its title to a proverb which expressed the superfluity of naughtiness, and how its evil haunts had flung away the once rare chance of sheltering virtue from persecution, when the good Onius was tempted from it to be murdered by the governor of its protecting city. Well, I think at this point it would be appropriate to recap the story of Paul and get a bird's eye view of his life. We're tracking him into Antioch, and this is going to be one of the launching pads of his ministry in the old world. But let's take a bird's eye view of his life. Saul of Tarsus was born in Cilicia, what is now that part of modern Turkey, located on the northeast coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And would appear that Saul's father was a successful merchant who was financially able to send his son to be a student in the school of the famous liberal, strangely enough, Gamaliel in Jerusalem. And it would also appear that his friend Barnabas had been a student in the same school about the same time. Now, it does not appear that Saul ever saw Jesus in the flesh, yet their times overlapped, and both Jesus and Paul knew some of the same geographical places. Paul makes his appearance in the book of Acts at the time of the martyrdom of Stephen, which is Acts 7, and not very long after the crucifixion of the Lord Jesus Christ and the birth of the Church of Jesus on the day of Pentecost.
Every 6 seconds, in developing nations all over the globe, a child dies for the lack of a few cents worth of food or medicine. As you've been listening to me, 3 children have already died. Children who have so much potential dying a horrible death due to hunger. The change in your purse or your pocket could probably feed that child for a day or more, and yet that clock keeps ticking and children keep dying. For almost 6 decades, World Missionary Evangelism has been pulling children from the brink of death back to life. And we've been doing it through programs like Food for Hunger. Today, you can be a part of that. Today, you can save a life. Today, you can build a bridge from hopelessness to hope and fully show the compassion that you have in your heart. Remember, as you listen to this 2-minute spot, 12 children have died. Why don't you make an impact and save one right now? The clock is ticking on another life. Won't you stop the death of one child right now?
Well, we're recapping the life of Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul was a Jewish fanatic. And he set about, before he was converted, persecuting the emerging church. And his persecutions and those of others scattered the church abroad to places such as Damascus and Antioch in Syria. And it was while Saul was hunting Christians in Syria that he was struck from his horse and blinded. Now, Paul recognized this as an encounter with the Lord, and he became a believer in Jesus Christ. And then Paul started preaching Jesus in the synagogues. And he in turn was forced by Jewish persecution to flee from Damascus to Jerusalem, where he preached boldly. But once again, Jewish persecution led to his Christian friends sending him back to his home in Tarsus, much to their relief and rest. We have to face the fact that the Christian leaders in Jerusalem were very happy to get Paul on his way and get him out of there. It reminds me of a time when I first came to the United States with my family, and we were preaching in a church on the West Coast. I won't tell you the name of the church, but it's a well-known Pentecostal denomination. And my father was preaching, and he was a man who prayed, and he could preach with tremendous conviction. And so much conviction, in fact, that the pastor of the church got under conviction and got very uncomfortable. And finally, when my father quit preaching, the pastor of the church said, "Let's do something. Let's do something for them. Let's give them enough money to get them out of town." And that was exactly how the religious leaders in Jerusalem felt. They wanted to get Paul out of town. Now, Paul makes an interesting statement in his epistle to the Galatians, when he says in the epistle to the Galatians, chapter 1, verse 15 through Galatians 2 and 2, Paul says, quote, "But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, when it pleased God to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the heathen, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood, neither did I go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before me, but I went into Arabia and then returned again to Damascus." Now, how long was Paul in Arabia? About 3 years. So Paul says, then after 3 years, I went to Jerusalem to see Peter and abode with him, or stayed with him, 15 days. But of the other apostles, I didn't see any save James, the Lord's brother. And afterwards I came into the regions of Syria and Cilicia and was unknown by face to the church of Judea which were in Christ. In other words, people had heard of Paul. But these were not days of newspapers in our sense with photographs. No one knew what Paul looked like. They knew about him, or they knew all about him. But what he looked like, they didn't have a picture of Paul hanging in the post office or in public. So they didn't know what he looked like, and they couldn't recognize him by his face. But they had heard this, that he which persecuted us, that's the Christians in the past, now preached the faith he once destroyed, and they glorified God in me. Then, says Paul, and I'm reading this because so many people have the idea that Paul got struck from his horse, went out preaching, and the rest is history. No, that is not so. Paul went through a period, 14, 15, 16, 17 years or more, of spiritual formation. So Paul says, then 14 years after, I went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me. And I went up by revelation. In other words, he didn't go up as a social gesture or didn't go up on any other basis, but because the Lord showed him to go up. And I went up by revelation. And I communicated to them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation. In other words, Paul didn't get up and start publicly preaching to the Jews what he had been preaching to the Gentiles. And he said, I didn't do that lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. What did he mean? Paul is saying, I could have been wrong. And I wanted to find out if I was wrong. I wanted to check with James. I wanted to check with Peter. I wanted to check with the leaders in Jerusalem. Am I right and am I wrong? Well, that shows a lot of grace and humility on Paul's part. But neither Titus, who was with me, being Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Now, when Paul talks about being separated from his mother's womb, he's not talking about his natural mother in the flesh. What Paul is talking about is his spiritual mother, Judaism, and not his physical mother. In other words, he is saying, when it pleased God, who called me by his grace and separated me from Judaism. There's a lot of significance to the order of those words that Christian teachers and preachers and leaders ought to think about. It may not mean a lot to the congregation, but there's an order to those words. He separated him from Judaism. And it then appears highly probable that Paul was having questions in his heart and mind about Judaism before his final conversion and change. In other words, it's not just that Paul got knocked from his horse, but Paul was going through a period of thinking and questioning and wondering about Judaism, but God works all things well.
World Missionary Evangelism, through its wide variety of mission outreach programs, is an evangelical force in developing nations, and it all begins with native missionaries. Called by Christ to do his work, our native missionaries are first and foremost soul winners. Often facing hostile opposition, they have the courage to reach out in compassion to the lost, sharing the good news with those in their communities. But that is just the beginning of WME's evangelistic programs. World Missionary Evangelism reaches children through vacation Bible schools and Christian schools. So even as we feed the hungry bodies of little ones, we also feed their souls. For almost 6 decades, WME has been building churches in both urban and rural areas. Most of these churches are used every day of the week and become beacons of light in the areas where they serve. Churches not only provide worship opportunities, but they also offer a community gathering point, education, childcare, and even serve as feeding centers for the hungry. WME not only sponsors native missionaries, we train them. World Missionary Evangelism has local pastoral education programs for new missionaries and continuing education programs for those who have been in the field for years. WME also has Bible colleges that provide degree programs for those seeking a fuller knowledge of the Bible in Christian outreach. The evangelism in World Missionary Evangelism is not just a part of our name. It defines our mission, our focus, and is at the heart of everything we do.
Well, we have been talking about the spiritual shaping and reshaping that Paul was going through. I said in the last segment that a lot of people seem to have the idea that Paul was struck from the horse in Damascus, recovered his sight, and suddenly went out preaching, and the rest is history, and that's not so. We are talking about a lapse of at least 3 years plus 14 years, or a total of 17 years, from Paul's conversion to his conflicts with Judaizing Christians in Jerusalem. Now, what do I mean by Judaizing Christians? We've said this before, but let's say it again. There were Jews who became Christians. That is to say, they became believers that Jesus was the Messiah. But Christianity is not, and a lot of Zionist Christians need to realize this today, Christianity is not an adder. It is not adding belief that Jesus is the Messiah or even the Son of God, adding it to Judaism or the religion of the Jews, the Old Testament religion, the law of Moses. These Judaizing Christians were in the church, but they were still advocating the law of Moses and obedience to the written law and the oral law. Well, in the book of Acts, we read about the church breaking out in Syrian Antioch. Now, Syrian Antioch is about as different from Jerusalem as you can get. Jerusalem is Jewish. Syrian Antioch is Greek, plus mixed nationalities, and if it's anything, it is non-religious. And whatever religion it had was pretty base and crude and pagan. So in Acts, we read about the church breaking out in Syrian Antioch, and Barnabas being sent there by the leaders at Jerusalem to take charge of the work, and then Barnabas going to Tarsus in Cilicia, a distance of almost 400 miles, to get Paul to come back to Antioch and help him. So it is several years after his conversion that Paul begins to work with Barnabas in Antioch. And during the time that Paul was in Arabia, about 3 years, Paul was thinking it all through. He was wrestling with what he knew of the Scriptures, his understanding of the Scriptures, what he had been taught. He was wrestling with this and battling with it. You know, it reminds me of a man I knew about. He became a famous mathematician. But he said that when he was in college and he was taking different subjects, you know, calculus and integral calculus, differential calculus, partial differential equations, you know, blah, blah, blah. He was taking all this stuff and he was struggling with it. And he said he had friends that just seemed to just flow with it without any trouble. And he said he realized later that what was happening is they were just adding layer upon layer upon layer. But he was integrating it all and getting it together. And there are some people that just seem to be able to add belief on belief on belief and experience on experience, and whether it contradicts each other and doesn't integrate or not, they just drive right on. Paul was not that kind. Paul was getting it all worked out in his mind, his soul, and his spirit. Well, let's go back to Paul and Barnabas in Antioch, and the place where in the street of Singon, Saul began to preach. Now, Paul may have entered Antioch by the gate, which was afterwards called the Gate of the Cherubim, because 27 years later it was surrounded by those colossal gilded ornaments which Titus had taken from the Temple of Jerusalem. It was a populous quarter. It was in close proximity to the Senate House and the Forum and the amphitheater. In other words, the centers of political and social life. And every time that during his sermon he raised his eyes, he would see Mount Silpius, and he would be confronted by the stern face and rocky crown, the chaotic Greek pagan ferryman of Hades, because that face was carved into the mountain. But the soil of Antioch was prepared for his teaching. Remember, Jesus said to his disciples, don't say 3 months unto harvest. And he was in a Gentile part of the world, Samaria. He said, the fields are ripe already unto harvest. Jesus recognized he was the Son of God. He knew that the world was ready. And while Antioch may have looked like the last place in the world you would want to go to found a church and start preaching, it was in fact soil that had been prepared for the teaching of Paul. You know, it is always darkest just before the dawn. Strange thing. Strange thing physically and strange thing morally. It's always darkest just before the dawn. And when mankind has sunk into hopeless skepticism, the help of God is often very nigh. Well, bitter with weariness and sick with sin, there were many at any rate, even among the giddy and voluptuous people of Antioch, who were in despair of all sweetness and nobleness and were ready to hail with rapture the preaching of a new faith which promised forgiveness for the past and brought ennoblement to the present. Well, the work grew and prospered, and for a whole year the apostles labored in brotherly union and amid constant encouragement, and the success of their labors was most decisively marked by the coining of a new word that was destined for glorious immortality. The scripture says the disciples were first named Christians at Antioch.
World missionary evangelism has been taking care of children. It started with just a few little orphans in India and has grown to touch thousands over the last 5 decades. But what does child sponsorship mean? Well, child sponsorship means that someone just like you is providing food, clothing, medical care, an education, and in many cases a home in which to live for children who have no one to turn to. Yet through child sponsorship, there's a bridge built, a bridge from nightmares to dreams, an opportunity for those dreams to be realized through education, an opportunity for that child who had no future now to be blessed with a future that lifts others up as you lifted him up. Why don't you pray about and think about sponsoring a child today?